This is the Detroit Sports Podcast Network.
Do you play FanDuel and feel like you aren't creating consistent money-making lineups? Go over to the DFS Doctors on Twitter at the DFS Doctors and DM them with promo code Detroit Sports to get a free trial for their analytically formulated 70% lifetime profit rate NFL and NBA lineups. The whole purpose of playing daily fantasy sports is to get out there and compete and give yourself a chance to win. So go over to the DFS Doctors. Let them help you. They have analysts on staff that look at the best optimal lineup that you can put out there to win money. So why not take advantage? At the DFS Doctors, promo code Detroit Sports.
Ohio State beat writer Ari Wasserman from The Athletic joins us to take me to task. Next on this week's episode of Michigan Podcast.
But there's going to be one team that's going to play solely as a team. No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. The team, the team, the team.
Looks deep for Anthony Clark. Waits for it. Hit. Caught.
This is no time for that. In the pocket and a sack. Tim Jamison.
Brady gets terrific. Throws it. Get it. Touchdown. Knight again. Schultz just before Brazil got him. And a leaping interception by Woodson.
Harbaugh back to throw over the middle. Caught by Collier at the 5 on his feet. Touchdown, Michigan. On its way. It's good.
He's 5'7", 179 pounds, a junior at Michigan. But Jamie Morris packs a wallop, and he delivers for Bo Schembechler.
And here's your first play. Pressure coming. Sack. It is Glenn Steele, number 81, who fought his way through the traffic.
Option. And Robinson calls his own number, and he's going to score. Oh, an easy touchdown for Robinson and Michigan.
Win it. We're going to win the championship again because we're going to play as a team. And when we play as a team and the old season is over, you and I know it's going to be Michigan again. Michigan.
Go Blue, and welcome to this week's edition of Michigan Podcast. I'm Steve Deace, and we are joined by a guest this week who wants to take issue with something that we asserted on our previous episode about the talent gap between Ohio State and Michigan, which, if you'll recall, I said, hey, I acknowledge there's a talent gap. But if you go back and look at NFL draft numbers in the 70s, there was a talent gap then. If you look at NFL draft numbers in the 90s, when Michigan went 10-2-1 against John Cooper, there was a talent gap then. If you look at the recruiting rankings from 24/7 for the last four classes, the average player recruiting rank for Michigan is almost identical what Clemson and LSU, the last two national champions, have brought in. So while I acknowledge that talent gap, I disagreed with our guest's assertion that it's the biggest reason why Ohio State has curb-stomped, dominated, and humiliated Michigan for the last 15 years. And he wanted to come on and give his take, and I thought that was only the fair thing to do. So let's welcome Ari Wasserman from The Athletic here to Michigan Podcast. And Ari, it is a pleasure to have you with us. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Well, given, I know we're all saying this disclaimer right now, but given everything else is going on, I could be a lot worse, if you know what I'm saying. So
it certainly could.
Before we go back and forth on a give and take, I wanted to just give you the floor and give you as much time as you wanted for equal time to kind of assert your premise, and then we can have a conversation back and forth from there. So the floor is yours, my friend. It's all yours.
The reason why my attention was brought to your podcast was because of the previous podcast about recruiting Ohio, in which you kind of talked about me in a negative light for about 20 minutes. So I kind of was looking out for your podcast a little bit. And, the next one that I saw came about talent in recruiting and the discrepancy between Ohio State and Michigan. And I personally believe that Michigan is a top 10 program in America. I personally believe that Michigan could be a more competitive rival to Ohio State with the current climate of the sport and geography, and if their recruiting strategy was done the right way. And I currently believe that recruiting rankings and talent is the most important thing in the sport for every program, not just Ohio State and Michigan. So I can go back and I looked up a bunch of numbers, and I'm sure you guys know the numbers by now. But, the fact of the matter is that those talent discrepancies did, of course, exist back in those days. Comparing them to Woody Hayes' days, I think, is a completely different sport, and it's like comparing basketball to football. It makes no difference to me whatsoever, like what happened back in the 3 yards and the cloud of dust days. And I think the talent gap discrepancy in the current time and the current climate of the college football recruiting system is just becoming more and more lopsided every year. I mean, when you look at places like Ohio State and Alabama, they're the most talented teams in college football, but it's not even close in terms of like what you're seeing from some of the competitors. And if you go back and you look, just crunching some numbers for this podcast, top 100 players signed since 2016, Ohio State 43, Michigan 15. Top 10 players signed since 2016, Ohio State 6, Michigan 1. And the 2018 class alone, Ohio State signed 13 top 100 players, Michigan signed 0, which is part of the reason why I believe the game is becoming more lopsided in the last few years. 2019 rosters, Ohio State 5-star prospects 13, Ohio State 4-star prospects 47, Michigan 5-star prospects 4, Michigan's 4-star prospects 36, which means Ohio State had 20 picks of players before Michigan got to pick once. And I just don't understand how a person can say that talent is not the issue when talent is 90% of a coach's job. The accumulation of talent, the development of talent, and the display of talent is the coach's job. And if it's not talent, then the thing I want to ask you is, what do you think it is?
I think that Ohio State's player development is way ahead of Michigan's. I don't think, because the recruiting numbers for Michigan's roster in 2019 is almost identical what Clemson had this past season as well. Almost identical in terms of the total number of 4- and 5-star recruits, and they beat Ohio State in the in the national semifinals. So I think a player like
I do think.
Go ahead. I was going to answer your question, but go ahead. I want to give you extra time. No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
That's
there,
okay.
But the thing that I think you did that was very clever is that you picked Clemson as a comparison point, because Clemson is the best group of talent evaluators in college football. And in fact, I would say that Clemson is the thing that keeps me up at night in terms of whether or not talent is the end-all be-all, because they are the exception to the rule. So I thought it was a very good idea for you to compare Michigan to Clemson's numbers, because Clemson has shown a ability, more so than any other coaching staff in college football, to find a 3-star player like Isaiah Simmons and turn him into a 5-star first-round talent. And to me, I think that's a gift that I would pay millions and millions and millions of dollars to do in terms of finding a new coach. So compare it to Ohio State, compare it to Alabama. Don't go find the exception to the rule and then compare it to the exception.
That's fair, but I actually used I used 2 teams, the last 2 national champions. And just so you know what my line of thought was, the reason I did that is because the first thing I did is I wanted to know what the historic talent discrepancy between Michigan and Ohio State was. And what I found is there's actually just never been a time. I mean, I'm going to be 47 years old this July. There's never been a time that Michigan has been more talented than Ohio State. Just never been. Not when they were 2-10-1. Not when Bo was, shut Woody out 3 straight years at the end of his tenure. Ohio State was still putting more guys in the pros. That's just never changed. And so then here's the thing too. I'm looking at this from the perspective of a Michigan fan, which is, so we already have a historic talent gap with Ohio State. We probably don't have the means to close that gap right now, okay? So is there another way to crack the nut? No pun intended, since we're talking about a Buckeye. Or is there another way to crack the nut here? Is there another formula? And so I looked at the last 2 national champions. I had no idea what the data was going to show. And when I looked at the last 2 national champions, what I found is that from a per talent rating perspective, they were virtually identical. I mean, LSU is 90.8, Michigan's 90.1. That's statistically insignificant. And so then the follow-up question that is pertinent is the one you asked me. If that's not the issue, then what is the issue? And I think there's two things. Number one, I think Ohio State's player development is not they're not just recruiting better players, they're developing them better. And Michigan's player development is underrated, but nowhere near a Clemson's. And I look at a player like a Donovan Peoples-Jones. If he had signed with Ohio State and stayed healthy and played the same amount of snaps, there's no way he catches 100 total passes in 3 years. No freaking way. But that's what happened at Michigan. I look at Shea Patterson. If you would have seen when Shea Patterson came out of Ole Miss leading the SEC in passing, and if you would have predicted he would likely be an undrafted free agent in the NFL draft as a senior, people would have thought that was nuts, but that could be very well what we are looking at. So when I look at the player development, Michigan probably cannot close the gap, and they right now in a pure recruiting, and the reason why is they don't have anything to sell. The new car smell from Jim Harbaugh has worn off, and so every coach, you get that immediate bump. You know, you're selling your new vision, and the kids, they're going to help you reach it. Well, that's been expired now going into year 6. And so you can only sell results. Michigan cannot close the recruiting gap with this coaching staff until it defeats Ohio State and has something new to sell. And so what I'm looking at from a Michigan fan perspective then is there another way of getting there, or just resigning yourself to this is forever? Now, you should know, I've given up that Harbaugh can do it. I don't. The Ohio State game doesn't count to me. It's an 11-game season. I've already warned the audience this on my website over at Wolverine Digest. I drove people insane. I wrote a column about this. I mean, I am tired of loving my football team, and then at the end of the year, just feeling like the whole thing was a waste of time. It turns me into a terrible fan. So from my perspective, the Michigan Ohio State game just doesn't exist until Michigan makes it a game. I refuse to participate in any more of these bloodlettings. But for the sake of this exercise, I was trying to come up with another path of getting there. And when I looked at the last 2 national champions, what I found was if you develop your players better than Michigan does, and then maybe more importantly, you have to have an elite quarterback. You've had Joe Burrow had maybe the greatest season of all time. Trevor Lawrence is going to be the number 1 overall pick if Justin Fields isn't in next year's draft. And so that's the other thing too, is Harbaugh, the great quarterback whisperer, and he's yet to really develop a true NFL caliber quarterback. And in today's college football, especially with the way the offenses go, Ari, if you don't have that kind of elite quarterback, it doesn't matter that you have 11 guys invited to the NFL scouting combine like Ohio State does. When your quarterback is maybe an undrafted free agent and the other team has got a top 5 NFL draft pick, you're simply just not going to beat them.
Steve, the thing that you're missing here, and I appreciate a lot of the things that you're saying, and I agree with a lot of the things that you just said, but the thing that you're missing is, in using a Donovan Peoples-Jones as an example, is Ohio State is perceived to develop talent better because there's more of it coming in. Mm-hmm. So the conversion ratio of players who are successful and hit in college,
sure, there's more margin. Higher. You're right about that.
So you sign 5 Donovan Peoples-Jones in one class, and 2 of them become first-round draft picks. There's a much better chance of them being a very good football team rather than putting all your eggs in one basket. So when you go and you look at all the numbers here, and it's staggering in terms of the 5- and 4-star prospects that are on each roster, Ohio State has 20 or 25 more players on their team every year that are higher in the rankings than Michigan is, and that's before the season starts. Mm-hmm. That's 25% of the roster that Ohio State has. It's like a reset. There was a quote from an Ohio State opponent when they played Ohio State. It's like playing recess, and Ohio State gets 85 first picks. When they play Michigan, they get 25 first picks.
Yeah, I get that.
It's not even an even playing field.
I get that.
So for you to completely dismiss talent as a factor in this whole thing is nuts. And the other thing that I'll say is if you don't think that Harbaugh can do it, which I agree with you. I don't think he can. He had a really good class his first 2 years, and in the time since he's had 10 or 11 or 12 ranked classes, which are pretty good classes, but not classes that the third highest paid coach in college football should be receiving or putting together. It's just like I don't understand what people think is going to happen when these 2 teams line up. Ohio, and it's not just about I think you've made a point about Chase Young and Jeffrey Okudah's stats in your last podcast in the Michigan game. Mm-hmm. First of all, Chase Young is one of the best players I've ever seen in 10 years come through the Ohio State football program. Mm-hmm. And even if he didn't have a sack in the Michigan game, he completely altered the entire Michigan offensive game plan. And Jeffrey Okudah didn't allow a pass of more than 15 yards all year. But it's not about those 2 guys. Sure, they're going to be 2 top 5 picks in the upcoming draft, but it's about the battles, the the 11 one-on-one battles that are happening throughout a game, every single play, all over the field. And when Ohio State gets tired or they get hurt, they insert another top 100 football player into the game when Michigan does not have the propensity to keep up with them. There is no comparison. So Michigan and Ohio State being compared from a talent level is so lopsided that you're in the same realm as the middle of the tier Big Ten teams. And if you want to know why Urban Meyer lost 7 games in 9 years, or 9 games in 7 years, my mistake. It's all based on talent. And the most ironic part about this whole thing is, if you found one thing to gripe about Urban Meyer during his 7 years as Ohio State's head coach, if you polled Ohio State's fans, what you'd find is that most of the fan base was growing irritated with the stale nature of offensive game planning. Like, that's the whole joke of this whole thing. I think Jim Harbaugh's a fine coach. I think he's an odd man. I don't know how he can recruit at the highest level. But when you're putting these two teams in this rivalry in perspective, Urban Meyer killed it when he took Ohio State from a good program or a great program to an elite program by accumulating recruiting classes not even Ohio State has seen. Yes, in the 90s, Ohio State was more talented than Michigan. Yes, teams that have more talent sometimes lose to teams with less talent. But if you go and you even look at Ohio State's talent during the Jim Harbaugh era, they had a dip in talent in 2016 when they were number 5 in the composite rankings, and Michigan was number 8. That was the closest they've ever been, and of course that was the game that was the spot. When they're the closer in talent, they're closer on the field. I mean, the quarterback play is a wonderful thing to bring up. I agree with you, but the quarterback didn't give up 62 points. And if you want to go back and even look at the two comparisons that you made, I think I read a stat somewhere that there have only been 2 or 3 national champions in the last 25 years who have won the national championship without having a top 5 class on their roster from the previous 4 seasons, and Clemson was one of them. And I think LSU had one, and then they just signed perhaps the greatest quarterback in the history of college football in terms of his physical season. So to completely dismiss talent, it's like, what are we even talking about? The whole game.
I'm not dismissing it. I don't disagree with anything you just said because it's all true. I think you're also looking primarily at the last couple of years. I think this is, again, where there's a different perspective from an Ohio State beat writer to a diehard Michigan fan. All these years are running together to me. All right? This is just like one 15-year tumor. Okay. And so in the last couple of years, you are correct. I think your point, as if nothing changes, is relevant for the last couple of years, and will get more relevant because Michigan has no narrative to sell. Okay, but I don't think that your point explains the last 15 years. And I think that from a Michigan fan perspective, we are feeling the sting of an era, not just the last couple of years. Okay, it's a 15-year blight. Scarlet and gray blight on our existence. And so all of these things.
If you go before the Urban Meyer era, Steve, you have 2 coaches that didn't fit at Michigan. There's very, very straight lines to the explanations of this. And people were laughing at me earlier when I said that I thought another coach could get this done. And I do. I think that if a coach came in and designed an actual recruiting strategy at Michigan that focused on the Midwest,
I disagree heavily with you. I don't think recruiting Ohio helps. The last 2 years, Michigan's actually had as good, if not better, high school recruiting crops than Ohio has.
Do you even know?
What's that?
Can anybody even explain what it is? That's the thing. Like, you can disagree with recruiting Ohio being a main point of emphasis in their plan, but what is their plan?
Well,
nobody even knows what it is.
That they will tell you that's true. They will tell you,
it's a huge problem.
Well, here's what they will tell you. And I've heard Matt Dudek, the recruiting coordinator, and others say this, that essentially there's 300 players in every year that are capable of playing at the level Michigan can recruit. And then there's 100 kids that academically couldn't cut it at Michigan. There's another 100 kids. This is what they'll tell you. There's another 100 kids that, for whatever reason, shenanigans, bagmen, whatever you think that's a euphemism for, Michigan won't recruit. So there's 100 kids that couldn't make it academically here. They can't recruit. There's another 100 kids they won't recruit because of gray areas. And so every year they've got to essentially sign 20 to 30 kids out of that other 100 group of kids that they can and will recruit. That's what they will tell you their strategy is.
Yeah, I guess there's no recruiting is geography, but that's all it is. It's geography. And Ohio State recruits Ohio first, takes 8 to 10 players out of a very talent-rich state. and then goes and uses its elite level brand to recruit nationally. And I know that Michigan, and here's what my mistake might be, and then you can correct me. I think my mistake might be holding Michigan to Ohio State standard. And if that's the mistake, then that's fine. If Michigan wants to give up in the rivalry and doesn't want to be a part of this conversation, then I won't do it anymore. But when I'm trying to hold Ohio State standard, or Michigan to Ohio State standard, I think Michigan should be taking 8 to 10 players from the Midwest or Michigan that they think are good enough to play in their program, including some of the players within the state of Michigan that Ohio State has taken from them in the last few years that are very good, including a 3-star or 4-star prospect in Cameron Martinez out of Muskegon, who Michigan failed to recruit adequately this year, and then branch out from there. And you have a coach that's making, $8 million a year as a quarterback whisperer who has not started a quarterback he's recruited in 6 years as the head coach. So in terms of just other issues, I'm not saying that those don't exist. You can say you know more about Michigan's development and tradition and all that stuff than I do. All I'm looking at is hard numbers. And whenever I see anybody poo-poo the idea that talent has a huge impact on the results of the football games, my antennas go up. It's almost personally offensive to me because it's literally the only thing that matters in this game. And it's a very physical game. It's not like basketball where a 2-star prospect can go 6 for 14 from beyond the arc and close the game up. This is a very physical.
I think you're taking me a tad out of context. All right. First of all, I acknowledged the talent gap. What my point is, when you
acknowledge how big it is, because you're comparing it to eras where it wasn't. I mean, when you're talking about 30 players that are better.
You seem see. This is again where there's a perspective difference, brother. You seem fixated on these last 2 years of blowouts, and I understand why, because these were supposed to be Harbaugh's 2 best teams, and they got annihilated. Okay, I understand.
I've got a list here going back to 15 of the composites going back to Harbaugh's beginning.
Okay, but I'm going beyond
the beginning of Harbaugh's tenure.
I'm looking at this wholeheartedly as a 15-year issue. Okay,
How many years was Rick Flatt the head coach?
He was coached 3 of those years. Hoke was coached for 3 of those years. Hoke was there for 3 of those years.
Add that to 11.
Yeah.
And then you have 4 years of the decline of Lloyd Carr, and there's your problem.
Yeah.
It's not rocket science.
I don't disagree with that.
I don't know what we're talking about here.
I don't know what we're arguing about then either, actually. I think do you think there's a 29-point talent gap between Michigan and Ohio State? Because see, when both teams send 11 guys to the combine, and I understand Ohio State will have more first-round picks, there's not a 29-point talent gap between those teams.
And there's the other thing. I mean, there is, because it happens. But the thing that I'm saying too is you got to understand. And this was the other issue, and I'm not being condescending to you.
Well, that is condescending. I mean, was there a 24 or whatever? What was the margin that Purdue was leading Ohio State by at one point 2 years ago? Does that mean that there's that margin of talent between the two?
We can't use transitive property to explain results in college football.
I understand that, but I don't believe there's a 29-point difference between the two teams. I don't. I think Michigan is. I think beyond even the physical advantage, Ohio State has mentally defeated Michigan. And I look at simple things like Carlo Kemp is maybe one of the most well-spoken and just integrity leaders Michigan's had in the Harbaugh era. And that stunt that he tried to pull on J.K. Dobbins, taking his shoe off and crap like that, that's Taylor Lewan garbage that we don't typically do here at Michigan. Seeing him do stuff like that, that's a Sparty play. And I think that's the kind of stuff you do when you mentally are defeated by a team. I think that's how you get to 29-point advantages.
Well, here's the other thing I wanted to say. And this is the other thing that I don't think people understand when they're looking at recruiting rankings. One, the number 2 class and the number 1 class in the country and the number 11 class in the country are separated dramatically. And 2, you can add up 4-star prospects and put 4-star prospects next to each other, but you have to look at each individual 4-star prospect.
Right.
A top 50 4-star prospect and a prospect who's 4 stars that ranks 200. There's a tremendous gap.
That's why I looked at the average recruiting ranking of Clemson and LSU compared to Michigan. That's why I did it that way. I looked at the average recruiting ranking because of that. And what I found is they're virtually the same. Those programs just do a better job of developing their players.
The thing about development is that it's easier to chisel and develop a player that's already there. Like Jeff Okudah and Chase Young were the top 2 rated players in Ohio State's 17 class. And guess what? They're top 5 picks. I wonder how that happened. Yeah. It isn't because Ohio State's coaching staff is some genius filled staff that knows how to develop better than anybody else in America. It's because Chase Young came into Ohio State as a 6'5" kid with a 6-pack. I mean, that's what happened. Jeff Okudah's long and rangy.
But those guys are great. They also didn't win any. They also didn't win a national championship the last 2 years. Two teams with lower recruiting rankings did. LSU and Clemson with lower recruiting rankings won the last two national championships.
Absolutely, and I think that if you look back at the last 3 years of Urban Meyer's tenure, that I think that most Ohio State fans would categorize 2015 as a failure. I think Ohio State fans this year in 2019 consider that this year was a failure, considering it was one of the most talented teams that they've had. And just because Ohio State has been prevailing in this rivalry doesn't mean they don't have their own personal versions of their own failures. But we're talking about Ohio State and Michigan in the context of the talent and the gap. And if you want to understand why they can't win in 7 years and going back 20 years, it's very simple. It's about the players who line up on the field. And the fact of the matter is that you can talk about development, you can talk about recruiting strategy, but if you took Michigan could take 20 picks before Ohio State could take one, what gambling person on earth would ever bet on the team that can't take a pick until pick 21? And that's the way the rosters are set up. And if you know what, if Jim Harbaugh can't get the kids into the program that they need to do to compete with Ohio State, you've got two options. One, the option that Michigan fans seem to have taken, which is just accept it, or two, don't pay the guy the top 3 salary in America to bring in a number 11 class at a program that's probably richer than every program in America. At least the top 5. I think Michigan needs to hold itself to a standard of we're a top 10 program. If Jim Harbaugh, the savior, can't get it done, then you know what? Fire him. I know it's crazy, but you know what? Ohio State coaches fire their coaches all the time. They've hired legends over tattoos before.
I don't.
It's all about,
I don't disagree with any of that. The reason why I've given up. The reason I gave up is because I just got told by too many Michigan fans my expectations were too high for us to actually remain Michigan, and that I'm just a hater because I think losing 15 years in a row to Ohio State is just inexcusable. So I won't disagree with any of that. Here's what I want to do. I want to give you the last word because it's my podcast, so I get to do this every week. Right. And so I want to make sure that you get the last word here as we finish up here today. So, again, the floor is yours, Ari.
Okay. Well, all I say is I've been covering recruiting for 10 years, and anybody for any beat or any competition or any rivalry or any sport, whatever you want to tie, if you poo-poo, which is a weird way of putting it, and I've said that twice in this podcast for some reason, but if you dismiss talent or you make it less important than it is, then I'll take exception to you, whether it's Colorado State, Ohio State, Michigan, Florida State, Florida. I think Michigan is a tremendous football program. I think they have the ability, and I've argued with other Michigan beat writers over drinks 100 times about my perception of what I think Michigan could be if they held themselves to the standard that I hold them to. And I just think that talent is king in the sport. And I thought we were, in 2020, I thought we were past the idea that was even an argument. And the other thing I wanted to say, Steve, is I appreciate you having me on. You've been nice to me. You've allowed me to speak, and I've actually cut you off, and I apologize for that. But in the future, too, if you take exception to somebody's point of view or thoughts, I would probably suggest maybe getting in touch with them first instead of just trashing them on your podcast for 20 or 25 minutes before ever talking to them. Because I found your last podcast to be tremendously disrespectful and unwarranted. So other than that, I can disagree about sports because it's not a serious issue the way that what's going on in this country is right now. And, I appreciate you giving me an opportunity to at least express my viewpoint. And hopefully people listening can decide which one of us they agree with.
I appreciate that. Hey, by the way, I typically do that. I just thought there was no way we'd get a guy from The Athletic on our little Podunk, Michigan podcast here. So I didn't even think about trying. But if you are willing to talk to us in the future, we would absolutely love to have you on. I follow your work. I've suggested it even to other people, even in the podcast where I didn't agree with you a couple of weeks ago. I even mentioned that I do respect your work and enjoy it. So I appreciate you coming on the show here this week, and let's do it again sometime. All right?
Yeah, no, I do I think that Michigan fans, here's my last actual word that I think you might like. Michigan fans need to hold Jim Harbaugh accountable for his lack of production, for the money that he's making.
I agree.
And Michigan fans also need to believe that they can do what needs to be done to beat Ohio State. Because if they don't hold the program accountable or they don't demand more, then the rivalry is dead. And that's all it is to it. And I believe that with the right personality, and I personally believe that Jim Harbaugh is not that personality, which I said on Andy Staples' show, they can do the right things, but they just don't have the right guy in place, and they're paying him entirely too much money to do it.
Ari Wasserman from The Athletic. Good to have you with us. Thanks for calling us up and giving us some time. And it was good to hear your perspective, man. Take care.
All right, you too. Thank you.
You bet. That'll do it for this week's episode of Michigan Podcast. Don't forget to like, rate, and subscribe, whether it's on YouTube or iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play, whichever method you use to access us. The more of those we get, it helps us to spread the word to find other Michigan fans like you. We will be back at it again next week, and we'll continue our series on top 5 reasons why. Until then, go Blue.